why don't you, why don't you take the hot seat over there? And here's your watch back. That's about as far as that'll go. Sorry about the disruption, by the way.
Just to keep things interesting.
Yeah, well, it's probably not the first time, right? Okay, so again, you have 3x5 cards and pens. Just hold it up in the air and someone will come along and gather those up. And despite the fact that I talked way too long, we have lots of time for Q&A, so that's going to be great. Okay, so can I just kick things off by asking about the growing isolationism that you referenced? Even the Heritage Foundation came out opposed to the last tranche of Ukraine aid funding. So I think you're right that there's a lot of sort of something approaching isolationism sort of creeping in on the conservative movement. Like I mentioned in my remarks, there's never really been a complete consensus on the center-right on these things, but how concerned are you about a new House of Representatives with a small Republican majority as far as our continuing to do what you think we need to do in Ukraine?
Well, I think that across the country, popular support for Ukraine is very high, and I think that's encouraging. I think the risk is that if we enter into a recessionary period here, I think there's a real risk of that people will say, why are we faced with this burden? And I think it's very reasonable when people say we want to understand what money is being spent on, we want to know whether our aid is effective, we want to know if this is leading to a conclusion that we can understand. That's part of having the debate, and I think the Biden administration has failed very badly in trying to explain what they're doing, what their objectives are, what our objectives should be, and they failed very badly at the end of last year and in the first part of this year in not deterring the Russians from invading in the first place. So I don't mind having a debate on this subject, but I think it's important that people see if they don't believe that peace and security in Europe is in America's national interest, they think it's okay for Russia to attack its near neighbors without consequences, stand up and say it. Let's have that debate. Now, if they're worried about the effective use of the resources we're providing, if they want more transparency, I'm all in favor of that. Nobody has asked for a blank check for the Ukrainians. But it is important that we also see some of the benefits we're getting out of this. I mentioned the javelins. Look, this is field testing of a weapon system under actual combat conditions, and they're doing great. Our HIMARS systems, battlefield conditions testing, they're doing great. You couldn't get that kind of confirmation of the importance of these systems without, unfortunately, the event of this conflict. And as Secretary of Defense Austin said some months ago now, the practical effect of what the Russians are doing, these are his words, is feeding their army into a wood chipper. And the consequence is Russian combat capabilities around the world are down significantly as a result of this. No Americans involved, no American military combat casualties, and I think what we have learned, what we have gained from this, already more than adequately pays for the cost of the assistance we're giving to Ukraine.
I should at least introduce IPI's resident scholar, Dr. Merrill Matthews, just so people don't wonder who you are. Okay.
So the next question, and I'll do sort of a two-part one on this one. You mentioned Taiwan. Do you think the threat to Taiwan is imminent? And then related to that, what is the most immediate national security threat that we're facing?
Well, I do think the threat to Taiwan is near term. For a variety of reasons, and there's a long chain of logic here that because of China's internal weaknesses, that Hu Jintao is motivated to act quickly before we're ready. China's economy is in danger of going back into contraction. What Hu Jintao is doing is centralizing not just political but economic power in his government as well. That will have the effect, as any concentration of economic power in the government always does, of reducing Chinese economic growth. They're willing to take that risk because they want the political control. But it also means with the demographics of China, with an aging population, no social safety net, the great hole in the center of China's demographic because of the one-child per family policy that resulted in a huge number of abortions to abort baby girls, because if you're only going to have one child in the family, the preference is to have a male child. So they're now, depending on your estimate, roughly 40 million Chinese men of marriage age who have no prospect of getting married because there aren't 40 million Chinese women out there. This is a formula for instability. So the risk to Taiwan, there's a very compelling argument that it's in the near term. I think what we need to do is in two parts. Number one, I think we need to make it clear that any Chinese hostile effort at Taiwan would cost them a lot more than they would gain. I don't think China wants to take over a heap of smoking rubble. We need to take advantage of the fact that Taiwan's 110 miles away by sea from the Chinese mainland. I think we can do a lot in the near term to do that. I think Japan, Australia, others in the region will help us. South Korea, I hope, as well. But I think we also have to have a longer-term strategic vision of acknowledging the reality that Taiwan is already an independent country. Let's not kid ourselves. It's already an independent country. And the Taiwanese people, you can ask them, they've taken this survey question for 30 years now, asking the people in Taiwan, do you consider yourself Chinese, Taiwanese, or Taiwanese Chinese? Over 60% now say Taiwanese, 2% say Chinese, and the rest say Taiwanese Chinese. Very different than what it was 30 years ago. Now you can say, oh, but come on, they're really Chinese. That's like saying to us in 1776, come on, you're really British, get used to it. They see themselves as an independent people. They're a democratic society. And if the Chinese can take Taiwan without us effectively preventing it, our credibility across the Indo-Pacific is shot. And if you ask in Japan, they would say in overwhelming numbers they consider a Chinese attack on Taiwan to be the first step of an attack on Japan. So we need to do a lot quickly, but also strategically to enmesh Taiwan in security structures with other countries. The two most immediate threats, however, are the threat of the nuclear weapons programs in North Korea and Iran, and the continuing threat of international terrorism. And those threats have not gone away. It's very interesting as you watch what's happening in Ukraine that Iran is now selling Russia drones and apparently going to be selling them missiles to use against the Ukrainians. The North Koreans are selling them artillery and ammunition to use against the Ukrainians. The Chinese are providing them cover and backup and financial channels to get their money out into the international markets despite our sanctions. There's really now today an entente between China and Russia, and the two subordinate countries, Iran and North Korea, are part of this. So ironically, it all kind of fits together. This is a very real threat, but the threat from Iran and North Korea separately on nuclear weapons, not to be discounted at all. And if you want to ask opinions of those in the region, South Korea, Japan about North Korea, deeply concerned about it. In the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the countries closest to Iran, deeply worried about that as well.
We have a couple questions about Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I mean, I think anyone who tries to think seriously about this recognizes that on the one hand, it can't just be that if anybody threatens to use nuclear weapons, you can let them get away with whatever they want to do. On the other hand, we understand that the Biden administration has supposedly warned Russia in quote unquote the strongest possible terms that there would be serious repercussions. But what can the U.S. do? What kind of, short of military response, what can the United States do that's significant enough to stop Russia from using tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, I think I know I'm due to provide some good news here, so this qualifies as good news. I think Putin is bluffing. And I'm confirmed in that by what our intelligence community has said over the last 8+ months, that even when Putin refers to the possible use of nuclear weapons, there's no, they've said this publicly, there's no evidence of any change in the disposition of Russian nuclear forces. I think I completely agree. Whenever this subject comes up, you need to take it very, very seriously, and I think that's the only appropriate way to handle it. But I think you also don't want to overstate the nature of the threat, because if by simply waving a flag, what I think Putin is trying to do is shake the Europeans so that their resolve in support of Ukraine collapses. I think that's what his game plan is this winter. He may or may not succeed. I think the circumstances in which you would have to take a nuclear threat seriously would be if there were a complete collapse of Russian forces inside Ukraine, really fleeing toward the Russian border, because that would be a sufficiently grave threat to Putin's regime domestically that using nuclear weapons as a distraction might be something that's appealing to him. I think we're still a long way from that, but I think what the U.S. has to do, I don't know what the Biden administration thinks are unmistakable terms. As I said before, we failed to deter the Russians on February the 24th. That's not a good start. I think we've got to make it clear to Putin that he's signing his own death warrant if the Russians use a nuclear weapon. That's a dramatic thing to say, but you like to get their attention. If you can think of a better deterrent to the Russians using nuclear weapons, I'd be open to hear it. But I don't think we should fool around on this one. I think it's got to be said to them. That goes beyond saying it's just a red line. That is going to cause consequences for them they will not recover from.
I've got several questions here on the Abraham Accords, and my own personal thing was it looked like a great, one of the best policy breakthroughs we had in the Middle East. Your thoughts on the Abraham Accords? You might mention to it if some of them don't realize. And are they still in effect? What's the process now?
Yeah, well, for the entire period after the State of Israel was created, the modern State of Israel was created in 1948, the Arab world tried to destroy it, tried to isolate it, tried to prevent it from becoming a significant force in the Middle East as a whole. And there was a lot of concern about the Palestinians. There were several wars with Israel and the Arab states, and it looked like a relationship that was never going to change. But what happened and what led directly to the Abraham Accords, which are the exchange of diplomatic recognition between Israel and Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and several other countries, and more to come, was that both the Arabs, particularly the Arabs on the peninsula, the Gulf Arabs, the oil-producing monarchies, and Israel came to realize their strategic assessment in the Middle East was exactly the same, that the threat that they both faced was Iran, from the nuclear weapons program, particularly in the case of Israel, and from Iran's support of radical Islamicist terrorism on the other, directed often against those Arab states themselves or in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And it took a while and some really ingenious diplomacy. I was gone from the government by then, but I think everybody who participated in it deserves a lot of credit, particularly on the Israel and Arab sides, that they took advantage of the circumstances to say, since we see Iran exactly the same way as the principal threat, why don't we combine our respective comparative advantages, the enormous oil revenues that the Gulf Arabs generate, the extremely sophisticated technology in Israel, the entrepreneurial spirit there. Let's exchange diplomatic recognition. Let's work on mutual security programs, and let's get together economically. And everything we can see is the relationships are thriving. I think other Arab countries will join in due course, including Saudi Arabia. It's not quite ready yet, but they're doing everything other than exchanging full diplomatic recognition. And this is all a reflection of the tectonic change in the Middle East that you have after all these years of conflict, the Arab world and Israel seeing eye to eye on what really threatens their own people.
I have an interesting question here about Havana syndrome. U.S. diplomats overseas have been subject to some sort of weird, mysterious attack that has caused, I understand, in some cases, brain damage, hearing damage, and things like that. Is that still just utterly a complete mystery, or do we know something about that?
Well, we still don't know the cause of it. Coincidentally, a significant attack occurred just before I joined the administration, and one of the first things I heard about it was Mike Pompeo, who had become Secretary of State, said, look, they've attacked diplomats, they've attacked intelligence personnel overseas, and we're not getting anywhere with figuring out what the cause is. And so we all tried to push it ahead. My deputy, Charlie Kupperman, in particular, a former Boeing executive who knows about directed energy weapons as a threat, spent a lot of time on it. And, I have to say, we ran into a lot of bureaucratic inertia and opposition of people saying, well, it's psychosomatic and they're imagining these things. I mean, I was in London with the president once, and he was at the embassy. The rest of us were at a hotel in London, and people from the NSC staff were hit in their rooms by something. And I don't believe this is psychosomatic. I mean, there can be examples of it, but when they're attacking embassies, people have suffered these symptoms on the White House grounds themselves. I just don't think we've put enough of a priority of it to find out what the source is. My guess is it's probably the Russians testing this capability. And if that's right, it's very disturbing because it means they've miniaturized it to the point they can put it in a van or a truck or something like that and drive it around Washington. The consequences are if you can take out, incapacitate top military leaders in a time of conflict or top civilian leaders by these directed energy attacks on their persons, it can cripple a country. So I remain concerned about it. I have to say I wish we knew more. We don't, but we need to devote a lot more effort to it. I think it's very serious. I'm sorry, there's one other thing. The government has been reluctant to, in my view, take adequate care of the people who have suffered these attacks. Now, that has improved somewhat, but whether they're foreign service officers or intelligence officers or whatever, when they go overseas to represent us, we should have their backs. And this issue isn't over yet, but the government's performance on behalf of these folks from a medical care point of view has not been adequate.
One of the things I like about your book, The Room Where It Happened, is you go into extensive detail on negotiations on different issues, meeting with North Korea, response to Syria, response to Afghanistan, and so forth. And as you point out in there, you're there, the State Department's there, sometimes the Department of Defense is there, sometimes the Department of Treasury is there, sometimes the Commerce Department is there, and you're all trying to work through this. And just give, especially for the students here who've not sort of seen that, a little sense of how that process works, because you get a lot of different opinions in there, and somebody's got to sort of, everybody's working to press their point. And you get it's a different opinion than what you get of just watching the government because you're in the middle as they're trying to decide on policy.
Yeah. Well, one of the objectives I had in writing this book, but also the book I wrote after I left being UN ambassador, was to try and give people a better sense of how decision-making actually works in the U.S. government. And it's been my honor to serve in positions where I've seen more of it probably than I should have, but it's how the sausage is made often determines what the sausage looks like. And so to explain this to people, I think, again, so citizens are better informed, because if you're trying to read in the newspapers and understand what's happening, All I can say is you're not reading anything normally that's very close to what's actually going on. But it is important, and people may think that it's simply the president making decisions, but the only decisions that get to the president in a well-functioning system are decisions nobody else has figured out the answer to. There aren't any easy questions that go into the Oval Office. You can't bother the president with 1,000 issues that his subordinates should figure out how to resolve. But to do it effectively, you've got to try and do it as one government. And this is basically what the function of the National Security Council is in the foreign defense intelligence space. Is you get everybody together. It's a multi-layered process at various layers of the bureaucracy and meetings and papers, and it goes on, and it is bureaucratic. But the point is to resolve differences, to reach agreement, to raise up different opinions to higher and higher levels of decision making until either you reach a consensus and are able to affect a policy, or if you can't, you present it to the president and he makes the decision. And then the other half of it is following through to make sure that decisions are actually implemented. It's all too commonplace in the government to say, okay, our policy is X, and the bureaucracy says, well, that's interesting. And X may be the policy, but nothing's happening. You've got to formulate the policy, and then you have to implement it. And I just think the more people understand the difficulties involved there, the better able they are to understand when decisions are made, why they turned out the way they did.
We have about 6 minutes. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. But yet I'm trying to rephrase this, but yet we commonly refer to the president as the commander-in-chief. And by implication, that war making is almost exclusively the provenance of the executive branch. Have we given the executive branch too much latitude in war making? And have we ignored too much the role of Congress?
Well, I don't think so, certainly not in this day and age. You know, the declaration of war power is to establish that a state of war exists between the United States and others, which sets an entirely different legal formula on in many domestic areas and in international space as well. But you know, you can be at war not through your own choice, whether Congress acts or not. For example, consider this question. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, and we declared war the next day. When did the war with Japan begin? December the 7th. I mean, you know, the facts and circumstances you're given don't comport with Congress's schedule necessarily. And this has been true throughout history. In the late 1790s, we fought what was called the quasi-war with France, a naval war over our objections to the French interdicting our ships and things like that. There was never any congressional action on it, even less than 10 years from the adoption of the Constitution. And it's a mistake, I think, even for those who say there should be more congressional involvement to put their reliance on the declaration of war clause in the Constitution. The key congressional power beyond anything else that the Constitution gives to them is the appropriations power. And if they don't like what the White House is doing in anything, but particularly in national security, they should cut off the funding. That power, utterly independent of the declaration of war power.
You mentioned COVID and China. So most of what you've talked about is response to a hard attack, nuclear weapons or something of that nature. What about a biological attack, which might be more difficult to identify and be able to source in any kind of quick time to know that who the aggressor is?
No, I think that's a very important point. I spent a lot of time when I was in the State Department as Undersecretary for Arms Control on biological and chemical threats to the United States as well as nuclear threats. And it is a fact that a biological weapons attack could look a lot like a pandemic. They have the same epidemiological characteristics, and it's something that unfortunately the rogue states of the world got a lot of information about watching how we responded to COVID. I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying this was a deliberate attack by China. But if it were a deliberate attack, it would look a lot like this. I don't have any doubt in my mind that China has a biological weapons program. We do not. We subscribe to the Biological Weapons Convention, and unlike many other countries, when we sign a treaty and ratify it, we adhere to it. And in fact, it was an American initiative. People like to complain about American unilateralism. It was Richard Nixon who said unilaterally the United States is giving up biological weapons. We're not going to use them. But I think the risk is high, and you have to ask yourselves, is bat fever so important in China that they do all this research on it purely out of academic interest? I think we're going to have a debate over whether it was leaked out of the Wuhan laboratory or from the wet market down by the train station. I go with the Jon Stewart interpretation. You may have heard he said, look, if the United States were attacked by the chocolate virus and you heard that it had originated in Hershey, Pennsylvania, would you think it was a leak from the Hershey plant or from the wet market down by the railroad station?
Okay, we're going to have to stop there. Sorry. Couple things in conclusion. Again, first of all, please respect our need to get Ambassador Bolton to the private session with the Sumner Scholars. Number two, please go to our website and sign up so that you find out about future such wonderful programs. And then third, please join me in thanking Ambassador John Bolton for joining us today.